ENGOs, environmental non-governmental organisations and networks, and you can see some of our partners there, including Coastwatch and some others you may recognise as well. And our ambition, or our vision, I guess, is to see Ireland become a leader in marine protection, giving our species habitats, but really importantly, giving our coastal communities the opportunity to thrive. And I'll get into a little bit more about how that works in practice. And just what I'm going to talk through the presentation tonight, this is the cheat sheet. Some of the key points. Ireland's marine area is enormous, and that's also been referenced already. It's our view that its stewardship by successive governments historically has failed to deliver its full ecological, its economic and its social potential. And despite some progress, and there has been some progress, Grace mentioned some of it, that the quantity and the quality, and that's what Karim was talking about, the quality of our current MPAs in our SACs and our SPAs is poor, and we need to do better, and we believe transformational change is needed to do better. And on that, the Irish government is drafting new MPA legislation as we speak, so that is really encouraging, and it's really exciting time actually to be in Irish marine conservation at the moment. We have a really unique opportunity now in Ireland to get this right and to do it well. And then on the climate change focus, the theme of tonight's discussions, I wanted to kind of reiterate the point that at the end of the day, healthy seas, delivered hopefully in part at least by marine protected areas that are well managed, can help tackle the biodiversity and the climate crisis. And I'm sure that'll be addressed in the next presentation as well. So this is the real map of Ireland. So a huge area, over 490,000 kilometres squared, includes territorial waters, parts of our EEZ, parts of our continental shelf through the years, through different agreements. So depending on which exact boundaries you use for our sea boundary and which boundaries you use on land, it's between 7 and 10 times, our sea is between 7 and 10 times the size of our land mass. So it's a huge duty and responsibility to look after this area, on government and ourselves as a civic society too, I guess. And then just to clarify what a marine protected area is, because some people have different interpretations, but legally, and what we believe will be legally in the new legislation, the definition will be that a marine protected area is a geographically defined area of marine character or influence which is protected through legal means, so legal protection, for the purpose of conservation and or the restoration of species. So the restoration part is really important. The restoration of species, habitats and ecosystems, as well as their associated ecosystem services, processes, cultural values, and that all of that in that area is managed with the intention of achieving stated conservation objectives, or stated positive conservation outcomes, you might say. So now we know what a marine protected area is legally. You'll have heard before, and you may have heard other people talk about this 30 by 30 target, and Grace mentioned it. This is the target of achieving 30% of land and sea in a protected area by 2030, the 30 by 30 target. And when it comes to the sea part of that target, and when it comes to the designation of marine protected area, and when it comes to Ireland's commitments on these things, well, Ireland actually has already committed to protecting 30% of its waters in a protected area, that is to say in a marine protected area, MPA, by 2030. It's done this nationally, it's done this at a European level, and it's also done this at a global level last December in Montreal as well, under the UN CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, COP15. So it's very clear where the government wants to be in 2030, but we have to be mindful of, are we going to get there, and how are we going to get there, and how are we going to get there in the right way? And there has been progress, and I think it's really important to flag and acknowledge and to celebrate that progress. There's been progress in terms of designation, the extent of our current MPA network. So back in 2019, when Fair Seas began, there was around 2.1 to 2.3% of Ireland's waters designated as a marine protected area. And now, just a couple of years later, really, 2023, there's 9% of Ireland's waters are protected as an MPA. And you can see in that middle map the two huge green areas. They're two new offshore SACs, and there's also been SPA extensions to SPAs in the Irish Sea, and there's a new SPA in the Irish Sea as well. And those, I should say that those current MPAs are SACs and SPAs designated under EU law, so they're not nationally derived, they're derived and born out of EU legislation that Ireland has taken on and ratified in a sense. But there's also been progress in Ireland on the legislation side. So it was mentioned before, the government has committed to introducing this new national legislation which will help it meet its 30 by 30 commitments to go from 9% to 30% in just 6 or 7 years. We will need this new legislation, national legislation. So back in 2022, the general scheme, or a fleshed out contents page essentially of the MPA bill, was published. It went through pre-legislative scrutiny at the beginning of this year, and the Joint Oireachtas Committee published 45 strong recommendations about how that legislation, about how the MPA bill could be improved and how it should be progressed. Then in March 2023, Fair Seas presented in the Laoghaire AV room directly to politicians, firstly supporting the recommendations by the Joint Oireachtas Committee and urging the government to get on with designating getting on with enacting this important legislation. And then in July, the government missed its own deadline to publish the MPA bill. So we thought that we would see the bill before the summer recess in mid-July. That didn't transpire. And just last week, actually, Fair Seas presented again in the AV room in the Dáil at Leinster House. And again, we were reiterating directly to senators and TDs of the urgency of this legislation and the need for it to be strong and ambitious. And we don't have the bill published yet, but we know from Minister Noonan, who's been a real champion of this legislation, one of Grace's colleagues, and it's obviously really cares about this legislation, which I think helps. He said it should be published before Christmas, so fingers crossed, and we'll keep a watching eye on that. So we have this 9% that I mentioned. We also think about how effective those areas are. So the 9% is the quantity, but we also want to look at the quality. So as I mentioned, our current MPA network consists of Natura 2000 sites, that's SACs and SPAs under EU law. We're up to 9% now, but management plans and the conservation measures needed to actually improve the status of the stated conservation features are lacking or non-existent for many of our marine Natura 2000 sites, unfortunately. Ireland has actually been taken to court by the EU on this. It's got wrapped on the knuckles by the EU Commission. It's got fines. There's been recent court judgments that I won't get into now, but it's clear that Ireland needs to do better on how it manages its current MPAs, and it needs to do better when we think about new MPAs as well. It can't just be lines on a map. So our argument is that a paradigm shift of how we designate and implement MPAs in Ireland is needed, badly needed, is overdue, and that this new legislation could be that paradigm shift. And we talk about the targets in 2030. In some ways 2030 is an arbitrary target. Time is running out. But really, why do we need to get on with this as soon as possible? It's not really to meet a government target, whether that be national, European or global, these targets. It's because marine biodiversity continues to decline every year, every day, every month. There are reports after reports and reports at every level, national level, European level, Northeast Atlantic level, for sharks, skates, rays there, birds, including seabirds, on this ocean climate nexus that people talk about on every indicator. The reports, all these reports say the same thing, and there are many more that I could have included on this slide. That marine biodiversity is under pressure like it has never been, that is under threat from different activities like it has never been, and that the trends that we want to see go upwards are unfortunately all too often going downwards. So that's the real reason why we need to get on with this legislation. Yes, the targets are an important part of that, but it's because every day we waste, every month we waste, every year that we waste, marine biodiversity is in a worse spot. And then that brings us to what Fair Seas have been doing. So as well as advocating for the strong legislation, a big part of our work and a big part of our values, I guess, as a campaign and as a coalition, is to produce the evidence that will be useful for government when it comes to the actual designation and implementation of these MPAs. So back earlier this year, we published a report, Sustainably Financing Ireland's Marine Protected Area Network, and a fantastic report, but the key finding from that was that for a very reasonable 55 million between now and 2030, so over the course of 6 or 7 years, that for a very reasonable 55 million, we can fully and properly implement and manage and designate our MPA network to meet our 2030 targets. So I described it as a bargain at twice the price, considering the surplus that Ireland has, considering the economic position that we're in, and considering the potential there to help deliver healthy seas. It's a very reasonable sum. We also published the results of our ocean literacy survey. So this was 2,000 people in Ireland filled out this 15-minute survey. So it wasn't nothing. It was a lot of time put in to fill out this survey. 1,300 of those responses were usable, and we analysed. And unsurprising to us, that there is a huge support among the Irish people in Ireland, for better protection and better management of our seas and our coastal environment and our intertidal as well. And then just thought I'd put a nod to the Revitalising Our Seas report that we published at the very beginning of Fair Seas about 18 months ago, and that was putting lines on a map, identifying areas of interest for MPA designation in Irish waters. So that's what really kicked Fair Seas off, really. And then coming soon here, so unfortunately I don't have the details for it today, it's still being finalised, but we have a new chapter, is what we call it, of the Revitalising Our Seas report, and it's looking at the areas in Ireland that we should think about designating on the basis that they are climate refugia areas. So these are areas that make sense to designate now to protect biodiversity, but that giving on different scenarios of climate change, whether we stick to 1.5 degree warming or 2 degrees or 4 degrees, based on those different scenarios, what are the areas in 10, 20 and 40 years time that will still make sense and be the most likely candidates for where the biodiversity will be then under different climate scenarios. So keep a watching eye for that. That'll be a really interesting report, I think, when it's finalised, hopefully in the next month. And then most recently, I guess, what we've been up to is we've had this mass mobilisation of people. We've had an online petition, and we've asked people in Ireland to support us, I guess, in our call to government, calling on them to enact a strong MPA law as soon as possible. And we delivered 11,758 Irish signatures from people in Ireland to Minister Noonan last week outside the Dáil, and he gratefully received them. And I think it's more evidence of the real graw for the sea in Ireland. And I completely agree with Nuala when she said earlier, to an extent, Ireland has turned its back on the sea for many, many years, for many, many decades. But I think that's changing. And I think COVID, actually the lockdown has a big role to play in that change, but other things as well. But there is a huge appetite for healthy seas in Ireland, and I think what we try to do is highlight that to politicians as much as possible. So that petition is still open, so please you can scan that QR code there, or you can go on any of our website or our socials to sign or that petition, add your name, and do what you can and tell the government that you want to see this law as soon as possible, basically. So just the last couple of slides now. So I just wanted to put this up because this is what we pester and bend our politicians' ear about. What are our three key asks at the minute? And when we sit down with the likes of Minister Noonan or Minister Dara O'Brien recently, or whoever, we talk about these three things, that the new legislation, this new MPA legislation, must include, for one, ambitious and binding targets to effectively protect 30% of Ireland's seas as MPAs by 2030. Now, we spoke earlier that Ireland's already committed to this 20 by 30 target, so you may think, what's the use of that? Well, actually, their commitments at different levels, but it's not enshrined. That 30 by 30 target is not legally binding in national legislation. And that's what we need to have. We need to have it legally binding in national legislation. And this is the place to do it in this new MPA law. And what Karine mentioned earlier, it must include a target for 10% strictly protected. These are a smaller subset of our MPA network, which are really strictly protected, no damaging activities allowed in them at all, so, which gives the biodiversity, the species and the habitats and the ecosystem processes in them the full and best chance to recover, not just to be protected, but to be recovered and to be restored as well. And that's a really important part. These strictly protected areas are the gold standard of MPAs all around the world, and there's lots of evidence to show how they work really well. So number two, we need a robust management framework which clearly defines what will be protected and how. So this is really nuts and bolts stuff, but it's actually really important, and we also need to know, and it needs to be really clear, and it's an issue with our current MPAs, is who's the responsible government authority. So what's the governance structure around these new MPAs for the implementation and the management? And if you see something happening that shouldn't be happening inside an MPA, well, who do you call? And who has responsibility and who needs them to take action? And that's all in a big blur at the minute for our current MPAs, and it needs to be much more clearly defined. And number three, and I mentioned it at the start, we always make the argument for community engagement with local people and stakeholders at every stage of the MPA designation and management process as well. This is so important to kind of bring the buy-in from local communities. And from a biodiversity perspective, it's a selfish ask, because there's evidence from all around the world that from MPAs that have that community buy-in, the biodiversity outcomes are much better, and which makes total sense, because the local communities start to feel pride in the MPA, they start to self-police it, they start to look after it and care for it and want to see the protections expanded in many cases actually. And that's what I would love to see all around the coast in Ireland, is that bottom up kind of taking an area under the community's wing and looking after it and really taking charge of it, I guess. And this community engagement needs to be based on transparency, inclusiveness and fairness. So these are the principles of how stakeholder engagement for anything should be conducted, really, among the local, regional and the national stakeholders as well. We would, Fair Seas would consider ourselves a national stakeholder. I'm guessing everyone in the room here would be that local and regional stakeholder, and in some cases national stakeholder as well. So just a very quick slide before my last slide, is that time is running out. We often mention it when it comes to climate. Time is running out, and we talk about tipping points and planetary boundaries and these sorts of things. And it's equally, if not more so, true with the biodiversity crisis as well. And just to reiterate and highlight how time is running out, these Dáil sitting days, these are the days that politicians in Ireland do legislative work. They do lots of work outside these sitting days in the Dáil chambers and the Shannon chamber, but when it comes to actually progressing law in Ireland, these are done in Dáil sitting days, and there's roughly about 3 a week for the weeks that the Dáil sits, and that's not every week. So there are 16 Dáil sitting days to Christmas, this Christmas. There's 41 Dáil sitting days to Easter, and there's 79 Dáil sitting days to the summer recess next year. And that's not a whole lot of time when you consider all the priorities and what's going on in the world and how the Irish government has to respond to housing, health, foreign policy, and the million other things that they have to deal with. So time is running out. And just to say, I worked it out in the back of an envelope, there's about 600 Dáil sitting days until the 1st of January 2030. It's not a whole lot of time at all. So, and last slide, no, I lie, it's not my last slide. Next to the last slide, Marine protected areas help deliver healthy seas, and hopefully that's a point that you are convinced by at the minute, if not by me, then from others as well. And this healthy seas is really important, and healthy seas are better able to mitigate the impact of climate change at a global scale, because the role of the ocean is so important in climate regulation itself, carbon sequestration, which is so important in tackling climate change, and the absorption of atmospheric heat. Healthy seas are more resilient to the ever worsening impacts of climate change. So basically what that means is that healthy seas are in a much better position compared to unhealthy seas to withstand and quickly recover from extreme events that will come around due to climate change. And healthy seas are better positioned to help coastal communities, to help coastal people and their livelihoods adapt to the social and economic changes that will inevitably come about through climate change, and those changes that are already baked in because of the CO2 that's in our atmosphere. And that's in relation to productive and resilient fisheries, diversity of marine life generally, and for ecotourism, for recreational angling, and also coastal protection, which is really important. We've seen the flooding recently as well. These are all things that the services that the ocean provides, the coastal communities and the whole island, because we're an island nation, although we forget it sometimes, we rely on. So actually my last slide now, I say this all the time, is tell your elected representatives you care about the sea. It's there's a lot of talk these days about activism and how that looks for different people on different issues. In my view, talking individually, the most important thing you can do is tell your elected rep that you care about the sea or about the issue that you want to see change. Because when everyone does that, you can be sure that they're going to listen to the constituents that vote for them and make that change that you want. And I guess I'm preaching to the converted here, but don't underestimate the importance and urgent nature of this legislation in tackling the nature, but also the climate crisis. And I mentioned that just now. And to support the inclusion, so I didn't forget it, Kieran, support the inclusion of binding targets. That's the 30% MPAs by 2030, the 30 by 30 target, but also the 10% strictly protected. When this bill is published, if that's not in there, you'll hear from us about another action to tell the government to put it in. And hopefully it's already in there, but we're prepared, if it's not, to get that changed, amended. Let's move a little. The new MPA law will shape how we care for our marine species, habitats and ecosystems for decades to come. It's not just about 2030, it's about 2040, 2050. The legislation will be in place for decades, generations. So it's really important we get it right. So, Gura Mágaibh, thank you very much for listening, and thanks.